The big day has finally arrived. I'm going to teach you how to play and win your games with the Queen's Gambit, probably the favorite gambit of all the Grandmasters.
Why's that?
Because it's a lethal gambit, and if you don't know exactly how to play against it with black, you're going to have a really tough time. So, how do we start playing the Queen's Gambit? The first step is very simple. We place the Queen's pawn on d4. Why the Queen's pawn and not the King's pawn? Well, in this case, the Queen's pawn is the safest pawn of all. This pawn, even when advanced, is still defended, so it can't be attacked easily. Also, we don't let them play e5 because they will lose the pawn. They also can't attack it very quickly because it's a super solid pawn. And most importantly, the king is still well defended since it can't be attacked. A pawn defends it very well, and the bishop will never be able to come to c5 to attack, like an opening such as the Italian, Spanish, or Scotch, right? So these are already points in favor. With the queen's gambit, with the queen's pawn. Normally they'll play d5 or knight to f6 against us. Do you know why? Because they have to try to prevent us from placing both pawns in the center. That is, if our opponent is a real beginner and doesn't put up any obstacles to us playing e4, like if they play g6 or e6 or c6, for example, then what are we going to do? Take control of the center with these two pawns, and the space advantage will be significant. So, friends, there are only two moves that block the advance of d4. d5, which is the most common, and knight to f6. As I said, both among amateurs and masters, playing d5 is very popular, and we're going to immediately counterattack in the center with c4. This would be the queen's gambit. Logically, it would be possible to develop our pieces this way, but it would be very hard to make progress afterward, since we wouldn't have a good constant fight for the center. So come on, folks, let's not get sidetracked. Let's get to the point. c4 puts direct pressure on the d5 square. What I'm going to explain to you at the beginning is very simple. What happens if they capture this pawn? Because surely many of you are going to think, that's a totally free pawn. It's completely up for grabs. But don't worry, because if they capture it, you simply play e3 and you'll get it back on the next move. In fact, if they try to keep defending it, that would already be a serious mistake, my friends. Simply play a4, and we're undermining the base of their pawn structure. Whenever we have a structure or a chain, we need to undermine its base. Now they have several options. Taking this pawn would be terrible because, pay attention here, look at how bad black's pawn structure is, right? Four isolated pawns that we can capture here, we can capture there. Then we could keep attacking. This would be absolutely horrible. So the only two defenses they have are, for example, a6 and c6. If they play a6, well, with either move, they've already lost. If they play a6, we simply capture the pawn. They can't recapture because they'd lose the rook. This pawn is completely pinned. That's why here, against a4, they usually play c6, but they've lost anyway. All you have to do is pawn takes pawn, and now there's a star move. Queen to f3. And even though it might look like a pretty weak move, what it actually does is win the rook. There's no way to defend it. The only thing they can do is give up a piece, either the bishop or the knight. In that case, we'll capture it and thank you very much, because now we're up a piece. And not only that, but now, to save the rook, they'd have to move the knight, and then we could keep pressing. For example, with rook takes a7, and this position is completely winning. We could even take this pawn here as well, but I'll leave that up to your preference. But I'm sure all of you would be able to convert this advantage into a win. And something basic you need to know is that when they capture this pawn, thinking they'll have an extra pawn, but then they realize that defending it is a mistake, and just keep developing normally, then what you need to do is just keep playing logically. You capture this pawn, they can keep developing properly, and so do we. And here, there's a move that people often play against me, which is a serious mistake. Bishop to g4. Yes, it's true. They start to bother us because they pin our knight. But on this channel, we've already seen several times that pinning the knight with the bishop isn't always a good idea. There are rumors going around here, you know? I saw this in a video that Mikhail Tal, when he was a kid, used to say the queen's gambit is giving away your queen. So here, he played this move here, giving away the queen. Obviously, this would be a very bad idea because we would simply get checkmated. On the next move, a spectacular checkmate. But obviously, that's not what you should do here. There's a very simple winning plan. They're coming to attack you over here, but don't worry. Queen to b3. And now what are we doing? Well, we're diverting the attack. If you attack me on the right, I go to the left. And not only that, but look, I set up a brutal battery against the f7 square with the bishop and the queen. Not only that, I'm also targeting the b7 square with the queen, and this square would also be attacked by the knight. So here, the black pieces are already starting to collapse. If they try to exchange this knight first, be careful. You don't even need to recapture the bishop, because after bishop takes on f7, king to d7, queen to e6, that would already be a tremendous checkmate. So here, it seems the only viable way for black to continue when we play queen to b3 is to try to follow up with the move e6. But don't worry, because here we could simply capture this pawn, and we've won a pawn. We're also threatening this knight. If it comes over here, which is usually normal to attack both our pieces, we can simply play queen to b5, attacking the knight, attacking the king. And no matter how much they defend, we have an extra pawn and a great position. The two central pawns that can advance thanks to the knight. This is fabulous. So we come to the conclusion that taking the pawn, usually, if you don't know this, is not a good idea. It's important, when we play the Queen's Gambit, it's not a good idea to capture, as we've just seen. But here, the correct move is to defend the pawn. Now I'm going to show you why. Because this way, you reinforce the d5 pawn beautifully. A mistake I see very often is knight to f6. A serious mistake. Defending the pawn with knight to f6 is not a good idea, and I see it happen very often. It can happen this way or the other way around. For example, d4, knight to f6, c4, and d5. No matter the move order, this is a complete mistake. So what should we do if they play knight to f6? Simply, pawn takes pawn. Now we'll see that both options are bad. Taken with the queen is also there. Lie. Because we play knight to c3, threatening a queen that has to retreat. And then we'll play e4, so that, as you can see, we control the whole center, our bishops can develop, the knight as well. This position is much better for the white pieces. And if your opponent takes with the knight here, which seems much better, it definitely isn't, because we play e4 right away, threatening the knight. They threaten his pawn, but even here, I love this position. Setting this little trap for them, especially in rapid games, bishop to d3 is a really good trap, making it look like we're defending this pawn and leaving the d4 pawn hanging. But here, we would simply win the queen for free with bishop to b5 check, a discovered attack on the queen. They have to block the check. If they block with the bishop or the queen, we capture it. And here, a lot of people say, well, I'll play knight to c6, and the knight defends the queen. But we still win the queen anyway, because the knight can't move since it's pinned. This is incredible. Imagine you're playing against an opponent who's just a bit better. So this trap we just saw usually doesn't work because we play d4. We don't go here, but our opponent doesn't capture because they're smarter than we thought. So instead of d4, we're going to do the following. First, we'll play knight to f3 and develop our pieces normally. And a very interesting move, or for example, here you can play e4 first, develop over here, which is much better, this move order. And for example, if they try to pin you with bishop to g4, which here seems like a good move, no doubt. Why is that? Because we're going to push these pawns forward, and that's pretty annoying. A move like e6 would seem very passive, because we can still advance, and the bishop gets trapped. So bishop to g4 seems better, and then you can play e6 later. But here, we have a fabulous idea. First, d5. We threaten this knight. Important, not e5. d5, threatening this knight, and now you'll see why. This knight, sadly, doesn't have any good squares. The only good square it has is b8, and nobody moves their knight back to b8. If the knight goes to a 5, we simply win the knight with d4, check, and we take the knight, since this knight can't be defended. Plain and simple. So here, everyone does the same thing. You've got a brutal pin with the bishop. I position myself over here, and on top of that, I put pressure on the knight on f3. At this point, black is already rubbing their hands together over the amazing move they just played. But simply, what are we going to do? Capture the knight, giving up the queen. And why, Chesteche, are you giving away the queen if you don't have any mate? Well, because now this tremendous move is going to make us win the game. Bishop to b5. With which piece do they block or check? If they block with a knight, we capture it and they would have to give up the queen. So here, the only idea they have is to play c6. But even so, we're gonna win the game anyway. Pawn takes pawn. If they try to come, for example, with the queen, To prevent these discovered attacks, we would simply capture here, and then after the check, take the rook, ending up with an extra queen. So we've recovered the queen by capturing a bunch of pieces. Therefore, here it seems the only solution for the black pieces is to take the pawn. But look how easy it is. Bishop takes, check, and who comes to defend? If they put the queen, we take it. If they put the knight, we simply take that too. And as you can see, check, they have to give up the cool. And after the exchanges, this is very important. Really, really important. Because yes, we've won the queen, but so have they. Let's count. 2 rooks and 2 rooks. A bishop versus a bishop and a knight. The result, we have an extra piece. And now I'm going to explain to you the most important and the most fun part of the Queen's Gambit. Let's suppose your opponent plays really well, and instead of capturing this free pawn, they defend it. This is the best thing they can do, alright? Defending this pawn and not taking the free pawn, because as you've seen, things go really badly for them if they do. We'll develop our knight, putting more pressure on the d5 square. It's true, your opponent can keep playing well and keep defending this d5 point very well. We develop our pieces very well, and now we have several options. If many of you are tempted to play bishop to g5 because you like to pin, they'll simply play bishop to e7, and we accomplish absolutely nothing. So what do I recommend? First, provoke your opponent to play bishop to b4. That's the move they usually play most often in this position. In fact, as you can see, they're attacking the knight that's pinned by the king. They can jump with the knight to e5, they can bring the queen in. This looks dangerous, which is why they almost always played bishop to b4. But we don't care. Now it's much more effective to play bishop to g5 with this pin. If they want to go back, they've lost a tempo, which would be great for us. But usually they don't do that. Perfect. Does this pin bother us? No, because in 2 moves, we're going to move the bishop and castle. So this pin on his flank is going to be completely useless. Now, on the other hand, ours is going to be much stronger. So if they want to get out of the pin, they have to move the queen. And if they move the queen, we can double their pawns. This pin is way more effective than the one from the black pieces. Let's suppose our opponent plays brilliantly. So instead of explaining the exact moves, I'm going to explain the ideas. So that way you can not only play this opening. When they make the moves I mentioned, but no matter what they do. For example, if they castle, we stick to our plan. What is our plan? To develop our pieces. Which piece do we have left? A bishop. So e3, a normal plan here would be to develop the queenside pieces, but it's better to move the knight first, because that way it supports their other knight on f6, right? And so we want to develop this bishop. But here's an important detail. If we develop the bishop first, they could play pawn takes c4, and then we would lose a tempo recapturing with this bishop. So here's a trick for you. If at any point they capture, you capture back. But if they never capture you at any point, and when you have no other choice and want to develop this bishop, then what you should do first is capture the d5 pawn with a very good move. And now simply bishop to e3. Now you can develop this bishop. And as you can see, your pieces are much better than your opponent's. If they chase away this bishop, what should you do at any point in the game? Keep the pen, okay? I'm explaining all the points to you, even if the game doesn't go exactly like this. I'm covering all the aspects because one day they'll push this pawn to attack you, one day they'll pin you, so you'll have all the concepts under control. For example, rook to rook to e8, a totally logical move, supporting the e-file, a very good move. We're going to castle now because we can. Our opponent, for example, might play c6, right? Defending the center well, c5 would leave an isolated pawn, or pawn takes pawn. I'll make a video for you if you want about how to play against the isolated pawn, because it's really interesting. c6 looks very interesting, right? Also, it allows you to develop the queen. Queen to c2. We place the queen on a good diagonal thanks to the bishop. These are just ideas, that you can use in the Queen's Gambit. There was a game that went like this. Look, knight to b6. Because this knight here wasn't doing anything at all. It wants to try to jump to these squares over here, and so white took advantage of the central square. It's a move, knight to e5, that you can play in many situations. You put a knight on e5, and a good idea afterward is, after any move, to reinforce it with the f-pawn. So we've already seen this several times on the channel, and you all love it. We can not only reinforce this advanced knight, which I love. Look, this book by Nimzowitsch, let's see if you can see it well, talks a lot about this advanced post for the knight and how dangerous it is. If you want, I can also make a video about it. And not only that, but thanks to this advance, we can bring the rook into the attack to crush the king. How would that work, Jessica? Well, whenever they exchange here, before I forget, you should always capture with the pawn, right? Why? Because that way you reinforce the e4 square, you keep up the pressure on the point. On d5, and you also open the file for the rook. So whenever they capture, you capture with the b plot. It's that simple. And now what? Whatever they do. Well, we bring the rook into the attack. Those plans we like so much. If they decide it's already too late and they have to go back to defense, for example, here f5 would already win the bishop. The good thing is that in our position, we can start looking for moves that lead us to victory. The queen's gambit is an extremely good opening. If, for example, they play c5 because they say, well, if you attack me here, I'll attack you there. As you can see, we get there first, rook to g3. If they advance here, well, we can play bishop to h7. This isn't something to memorize, just ideas. And here we could even play this advance. If they capture us, we recapture with check and come out ahead in the exchange. And if they move away with the bishop, which is the most common move, I can even think of a fabulous move here. Bishop to g6, threatening the f7 square. And this bishop can't be taken because then we would win the queen. What a wonderful move, right? So here they have to defend the f7 square, but we simply take it anyway, because even if it is defended, we have eliminated the defender, check, and we still take the queen. Like I said, this is just an example to help you understand all the ideas behind the Queen's Gambit and how you can use them in your own games. As a reward for staying until the end of the video, I'm going to show you how to win the Queen's Gambit in 8 moves. This is a trick I've used many times, and I'm absolutely sure you're going to love it. So I'm only showing it to you because you stayed until the end of the video. All right, they play e6, a very good move, and then we just continue as usual with knight to c3. But what happens if they play the Tarrasch defense against this? It's a defense that's more popular than you might think. So pay close attention to what we're going to do because it's incredible. First, we capture on d5. All right, here, black usually takes this pawn. Why? Because as an in-between move, the attacker knight, what are we going to do? Where's this knight going to go? Well, we're not going to move it. Instead, we're going to play pawn takes e6, completely giving up the knight. And now, we're going to do the following. Pawn takes f7, check. And this pawn can't be captured, because if the king takes this pawn, we simply win the queen since it's undefended. But if black simply plays king to e7, they defend the queen. And now I'm sure all of you are thinking, well, we just bring the bishop here and win the queen, right? But that's not possible because they come in with a knight. And if we capture first, then they could simply block first even. So here, the best and most spectacular way is to capture this knight, but by promoting to another knight, so that since it's a check, they have to respond to the threat. And now, bishop to g5 wins the game. So if you stayed until the end and I taught you this trap, leave a like. It's absolutely free for you. As always, with another new video, my friends. Bye-bye. Oops, I didn't drop the cane. Well, now leave a like for this.